Hi, and thank you for joining my presentation on misinformation, conspiracy theories, and confusion during the corona crisis in Germany. My name is Thorsten Quandt. I'm a professor of online communication at the University of Münster. And in the next few minutes, I will tell you more about an ongoing research project on traditional and alternative news media in our country. In particular, I will focus on their coverage during the early pandemic. I will give you some insight on the actors and topics they covered, how the topics evolved and changed over time, and in what context these actors showed up. I will also tell you about fake news and conspiracy theories that were shared by some media, how this caused some societal problems later on in the year. However, before delving deeper into findings of the research project, I would like to give you some more context on the political situation and the corona-related developments in Germany. I think the knowledge of the national context is crucial for the understanding of what we found in our research, and how this might be either specific to the circumstances in Germany or refer to other countries as well. So let's start with a brief overview of the political situation in Germany. Okay, here we are. As you probably know, Germany is a Central European country with about 83 million inhabitants. The German parliament is composed of multiple parties, but traditionally two groups were in power, either the conservative Christian Democratic Union of CDU and CSU or the Social Democrats. Often they had smaller partners to achieve the necessary majority. Angela Merkel is the current Chancellor of Germany, and she has been so since 2005. Further, Merkel has been heading a grand coalition for most of that time. The fourth Merkel cabinet, a coalition of the Christian Democrats with the Social Democrats, started in 2018. Overall, this means that Germany had a relatively stable government under the same leadership for 1.5 decades now. And naturally, this had some impact on the political landscape. Here you can see the election years and the outcomes of the respective national elections, and the various colors refer to parties, roughly organized from the left spectrum to the right spectrum. Without going into detail, you can see that the two big coalition partners, Social Democrats in red and the Christian Democrats in black, lost some support during that time. In particular, the Social Democrats are suffering heavily from being a smaller partner in the government. As you can see, they're much smaller than what they were before. And further, you can see growth of oppositional parties. On the far right of the political spectrum, a new party established itself, gaining strength from conservatives and also nationalists who were unhappy about Merkel's centristic government style. This party, the AfD, is anti-Merkel, claims to be anti-establishment, and some of its members do support pretty radical nationalist and xenophobic viewpoints. More recently, they seemingly try to unite formally distinct anti-systemic groups under their umbrella, something we will talk about in a minute. So that's the political context in a nutshell. Now let's have a look at what happened in Germany during the early phase of the corona crisis. This timeline depicts the first 4 months of the year. In January, when the first outbreak of the virus at the city of Wuhan in China became public, it remained a foreign news item for most of the Germans. Sure, people were worried when they saw the Chinese government reacting with a tight lockdown, when they built an emergency hospital, and when the first reports of people dying came in. However, for most Germans and the media alike, this was very far away. The situation changed on the 28th of January, when the first cases in Germany became known. These were limited to the automotive supplier Webasto, and the source of the virus was known, a Chinese colleague visiting the company in Germany. The Webasto cluster was local and controlled, and it was not before 1 month later that the virus became a real concern. On the 25th of February, 2 people who participated in a carnival session in Gangelt showed up at a hospital with signs of corona. As it turned out, numerous people who visited that session became sick, and this marked the first larger outbreak in Germany. The government tried to contain this to the respective town and region, but it became harder to deal with the situation. The first 2 deaths in the country were reported on the 9th of March. Still, people were leading a relatively normal life, and some were even going on skiing holidays. On the 13th of March, Austria shut down the Paznaun Valley and the famous Ischgl skiing area, as numerous tourists and local residents were showing signs of COVID-19. Obviously, people didn't pay attention to hygiene regulations during some wild après-ski parties. This closing of the whole area led to a chaotic situation, with Germans fleeing the area or being transported to the Austrian-German border. In the following days, European countries were closing borders, the soccer league stopped, and it became apparent that the situation was getting out of control. So on the 18th of March, Chancellor Merkel addressed the nation in a TV speech, announcing social distancing rules and restrictions to public life. In contrast to other European nations, the German restrictions weren't a full lockdown, but still the measures were unprecedented and massive in their effect. Both on the social life, by the way, and the virus spread. The goal to flatten the curve could be reached during that phase of the light lockdown. This early phase of the pandemic is also the context of our research, and please keep that in mind when I talk about the studies and their findings now. Finally, we get to the core of this presentation, the studies. The studies are called Pandemic Populism and Pandemic News. You will find a link to these publications at the end of the presentation. And probably the first question is the motivation. Why did we do that type of research? There are 2 answers to that. A professional one and a personal one. The professional one is pretty simple. We've been doing that type of research before. We analyzed the last elections in Germany. We had a look at the use of social bots, whether they were used to influence the public. And we also analyzed disinformation campaigns and populism. So it was pretty logical to continue that type of research during the pandemic. The personal answer is pretty interesting because nearly all of my team members, and myself as well, received some kind of fake news or conspiracy theorist message via WhatsApp or Facebook or social media. And we were wondering, where's that coming from? Is it produced and shared via alternative news media? And is it shared also on the more traditional news media channels? And from that, we asked a pretty simple question: what happened in news outlets and alternative media during the pandemic? We derived some sub-questions from that, looking at reach and interactions. We analyzed the topical structure and how it changed over time. We had a look at the actors and the context in which they show up. And we also analyzed the sentiments in particular negativity. And the probably most interesting thing for this presentation is the last point here, the fake news and the conspiracy theories. So we had a look whether they show up in alternative news media channels and on the traditional news media channels. Fake news are fabricated news where the core of the message is wrong. Conspiracy theories were defined as unverified rumors, assumptions, and speculation where it's not fully clear at the time of production or sharing whether they're true or not. It's simply unverified, as I said. And how did we do that? In principle, this was a very traditional content analysis. We analyzed the news channels and the alternative news on Facebook in Germany. Why did we choose Facebook? Basically because it's the most important social media channel, and because nearly all of the news media and alternative news channels actually have a Facebook page and share their news there as well. So it's also a pretty good way to access all of the news out there, at least in Germany. We also used it because we had access. We could get the Facebook information via CrowdTangle because we're part of Facebook's transparency initiative. And the data gathering for this presentation is based on the month of January, February, and March, but it's still ongoing, so there will be further publications down the road. The sample of these 3 months consisted of 100,000 mainstream media posts and a bit more than 15,000 alternative media posts. And we also collected more than 1,000 posts of fact-checkers as a comparison. So the fact-checkers actually gave us information what is fake news and what is conspiracy theories, and we could actually use that to identify that type of information in the mainstream media and alternative media. We identified 18,000 posts that were directly related to Corona, and naturally we couldn't do that by hand anymore, so we used computers for that. So it's a computational content analysis, but we also did some type of qualitative analysis that wasn't done with computers, and we also interpreted the data, so it's actually a mixture of computational methods and more manual methods. And as I said before, we published preprints actually during the pandemic, and I will tell you a bit more about the reactions at the end of this presentation. So what did we find? Well, as we did basically analyze all the news posts shared during the analysis phase, we could do some pretty fine-grained analysis. So this first slide shows the topical flow over time. You can see two important things here. First of all, the overall output of news did not grow very much during the early pandemic. Obviously, there are some limits to the output of the news and information system, even in a crisis. And by the way, the recurring dents in the topic flow are the weekends, so even in the pandemic, some work and production routines remained pretty stable. The second important finding refers to the green segment of the graph. That's the corona-related posts. As you can see, during January and most of February, the pandemic wasn't a big topic. It just became relevant when the first uncontrolled outbreaks happened, for example, that case of the Gangold Carnival session. After that, the topic developed very quickly, taking over most of the news output. The second slide shows the main actors. Findings here are consistent with previous studies on news in the crisis, so there's a strong focus on political leaders and decision makers here. Interesting enough, traditional news media also covered companies, actors from the economy, and other actors that are not directly related to politics. In contrast, alternative news media primarily focused on the political power elite, as you can see in this network analysis. Here we place the actors in the context of the terms that are closely linked to them in the post. And this focus on power and politics is very typical for alternative news media in Germany, as they perceive themselves as critical of the political system and the elite. Many of them are also critical of the current democratic system per se, and they also have a certain preference for leaders with autocratic tendencies. And many alternative news media in Germany do also have links to right-wing ideologies, which are also reflected in the semantic network. The next slide is a more detailed version of the news flow analysis, this time differentiated by topics. These are the topics we found in the traditional news media and how they evolved over the analysis period. Interestingly, the various key events I mentioned before are reflected as peaks in the output. They also changed the topical composition of the news flow. So in the beginning, we had a lot of reporting on infection numbers and some signs of horse race reporting. That means at that time, journalists were comparing Germany to other countries, basically saying we're doing better than country A, but worse than country B. And when the spread of the virus in the country accelerated, we see a broadening of the reporting, now mentioning societal, economic, and health effects. We also found some rally round the flag reporting and calls for national cohesion, but that is also a reflection of the TV address of Merkel that I mentioned earlier on. Now let's have a look at the alternative news media. Interesting enough, the topic flow looks very similar, so the overall shape is comparable. This means that alternative news media react to the same type of events. However, the topical composition is a very different one. Just have a look at the categories. Alternative media were primarily criticizing the failures of the government, called the measures unreasonable. They were reporting on chaotic crisis management, and we also found signs of fear-mongering. So interestingly, some even linked the crisis to migration, claiming that the virus was spread by migrants and foreigners. This serves the xenophobic and right-wing readership of some of these media. The negativity of alternative news media can also be observed in the sentiment analysis that I will show you in a second. Here it comes. And this slide depicts the prevalence of negativity sentiments of the corona posts. So the orange line represents the traditional mainstream media, the other one, the alternative media. And as you can see, the alternative media are consistently more negative than the mainstream media. This is also a reflection of their system critical approach. And we also found a lot of derogatory terms for politicians and representatives of the state in their reporting. Finally, we checked for the presence of fake news and conspiracy theories on both mainstream media and alternative media. Indeed, we found some signs of these. However, the good news is that the traditional journalistic media covered them as what they are. They basically portrayed them in the context of stories about fake news or conspiracy theories. The situation is different for alternative media. We did find many signs of conspiracy theories. We found not so many signs of fake news. The only news item that showed up there was the ibuprofen drug makes COVID worse story. However, they shared and pushed quite a few conspiracy theories, as I said, and they didn't contextualize them, but actually supported their claims and speculation. In particular, they shared the story that the German federal government already knew about the coming events as early as 2012 and tried to cover it up. And we also found several versions of the notion that corona is man-made and originates from a lab, for example, for experimental bioweapons. Some also claimed that Bill Gates is behind the pandemic, as he wants to push vaccination with the goal of somehow controlling the world, or some other sinister goal. And finally, the claim corona is not worse than the flu shows up quite frequently, often backed up by dubious experts without notable qualification for the topic. And again, in some cases also linked to some dark conspiracy by the power elite. So overall, alternative media added to societal confusion during the early pandemic and also tried to push an anti-systemic narrative consistent with their ideological goals. In that sense, and despite their label, they were no real alternative to traditional mainstream news media during the early pandemic. Usually, presentations on research projects end with some kind of summary or outlook. However, in this special case, we already had some initial reactions to our preprints, and that was an interesting experience to say the least. Traditional mainstream media covered our research extensively, and my research team and me were interviewed by leading global media like the Washington Post or CNN. That was actually quite nice. The reaction of alternative media was not so nice. They basically denounced me personally, and I received a lot of, I would say, unfriendly mails from their readers. And just let me read a few of them so that you get an impression of what happens when you do research on fake news and conspiracy theories on alternative media. So, well, the first one says, on the day X, the real academics, people with intellect, will stand up and apologize for attempts of a dictatorship of opinions like yours. My contempt for you. The next one said, I'm angry about your research. You are following the mainstream that is on its way to limit our freedom of expression. I regret that your pathetic effort is financed through taxpayers' money. And then the third person said, there are no deaths by corona. The only ones are by victims of system-believing orthodox medical practitioners, as there are no disease-causing viruses. And one person just asked, multiple times actually, who's behind your research? And the last one said, stop this delusion of the public. So, these reactions were not only unpleasant on a personal level, but also indicative of some developments in the country. So let's have a look at the timeline and what happened after our research. In spring, already during the phase of the lockdown, a protest movement against the corona measures formed, often with claims that are similar to what we found in our content analysis of alternative media. For example, these people say that COVID-19 isn't more dangerous than the flu, and some of them also believe sinister conspiracies or a corrupt power elite to be behind this. In many ways, the movement mirrors alternative media and vice versa, and it somehow unites a broad spectrum of esoterics, conspiracy theorists, and right-wingers who share an anti-systemic view and doubts about the functioning of the democracy. After the end of the lockdown, Germany saw a few local outbreaks. For example, there was one at a large company in the meat industry called Tönnies. That was, I think, more than 1,500 cases in just a few days. So there were also protests against that. Despite this, and despite these local outbreaks, the holiday season saw a lot of Germans traveling, at least within the country, and enjoying the sun at the beaches, and it looked a bit like this. Actually, that's a photo from that period. And despite the loosening of these restrictions, the protests actually continued, and there were 2 large demonstrations of the anti-mask movement in Berlin. The last one escalated in a large group of protesters trying to storm the parliament, waving the Reichsflag, carrying QAnon signposts, but also some of them American flags. Some were shouting for Putin, some for Trump, and some others were screaming nationalist or even Nazi slogans. So these protests continued what we already have seen in the content analysis of alternative news earlier on in the year. And in that sense was just the logical continuation of the crossover extremism present in some of these alternative outlets. We will see how this continues. Germany was quite successful in flattening the curve, but despite or because of these successes, protests continue. So after the holiday season, infection numbers went up, and we will see what the fall will bring and how media react to it. In any case, we will continue to analyze both mainstream and alternative news media, and we hope to publish findings on the latter phases of the crisis as soon as possible. Thank you.